Thank you, Emily. As she said, my name is Kate Hogle. I am a Coastal Resource Specialist at the Department of State. For those who are unfamiliar with Department of State, the Department of Office of Planning Development administers the Coastal Management Program and Inland Waterways Program for New York State. Preparing a watershed management plan is considered a component of a local waterfront revitalization program and is an eligible grant category through the CFA. The local waterfront revitalization program provides matching funds on a competitive basis to villages, towns, cities, or counties on behalf of a village, town, or city located along one of New York's coasts or designated inland waterways to foster community and waterfront revitalization. To apply for funding to complete a watershed management plan with the Department of State, you will need a municipality to sponsor the grant and then letters of support for the municipalities within the watershed. On the Department of State website, there is a link to see the full list of eligible waterways, and that list is updated periodically as the legislator add more waterways. Our funds may be used for planning, design, and construction, but may be eligible for design, but you are only eligible for design and construction funding if you have a substantially completed watershed plan through the Department of State. The focus of this presentation is how to move through our framework, primarily from characterization to plan recommendations and implementation, and making that connection between gathering data and taking action, although I am gonna go through the whole framework for those who aren't familiar. I will be showing examples throughout this, but as an FYI, I purposely did not pull in examples from within the Hudson River Watershed, as I know there are a lot of case studies that are being presented, and we have worked with a lot of those communities, and I didn't want to steal anybody's thunder or repeat any of the information. All right, so the watershed planning protection approach recognizes the need to address not only the individual water resources within any given watershed, but also the land from which the water drains to these water bodies. It allows communities to integrate water and land resource protection and restoration with growth management at the local and regional level, balancing the environmental and economic factors to encourage a healthier, more resilient watershed. Watershed planning must ensure that the causes and sources of water quality concerns are identified, that key stakeholders are involved in the planning process, and that the restoration and protection strategies are identified that will address those concerns. These are the main sections of the DOS watershed plan. As I mentioned on the first slide, while we'll go over all the sections, I am going to be focusing on the recommendations and the implementation strategy. Before diving into the specifics of the different actions, I do want to touch base on one essential part of a DOS watershed plan, or really any planning done in partnership with the Department of State that we expect to be woven throughout the planning process. We believe that public engagement and local involvement is critical to developing a watershed plan that will not only be reflective of the local conditions and needs, but will also ensure the support and investment in the plan once you move into implementation. Many communities choose to work with a consultant to develop their watershed management plans, although that's not necessarily a requirement. But regardless of who writes the plan, Department of State requires local knowledge input through a variety of sources. One of the first tasks in a work plan with us is the establishment of a watershed advisory committee. They'll facilitate communication and cooperation of the involved local government, state agencies, and other stakeholders that are essential to the development and implementation. The committee should be representative of a variety of project stakeholders, and it is expected to meet regularly throughout the watershed planning process and provide information, review documents, and guide the whole process. Preparation of a community outreach plan is developed after the watershed advisory committee is established and a consultant is on board. Again, if you're using a consultant, which will identify key individuals, organizations, and entities that should be involved, and will detail public meetings that should be organized to maximize attendance and participation of the involved community members. During COVID, we'll have learned so much about public engagement, and it will likely continue to evolve and be different for every community or watershed. Outlining an inclusive plan that fits your watershed early in the process ensures public participation is carried through. As identified in the outreach plan, a minimum of 3 public meetings must be held throughout the planning process. DOS describes at what stage these meetings should occur to offer the best opportunities for meaningful feedback. Many communities outline and complete a variety of public engagement to ensure as broad of a net cast as possible, from tabling farmers markets to online surveys, posters put up at local gathering places, Zoom meetings, in-person meetings. There are many opportunities to educate and engage your community in your outreach plan, and subsequent events should be reflective of what will actually work in your community. And then the initial vision and watershed goals should be a collaboration with a consultant, again, if you're using one, and the Watershed Advisory Committee. This will set the tone of the watershed plan and be used throughout the watershed planning process. A realistic set of goals and objectives will provide a framework for achieving the vision. These goals may be revised after the first meeting. Public meeting is necessary based on information gathered from the characterization and comments from the public. All right, moving into the sections of the plan. So the characterization, simply put, what the current conditions are within the watershed. As Emily mentioned yesterday, this is really a foundational section of the watershed plan. Department of State breaks this section down into 2 components. One is the description and the assessment of water bodies and watershed resources, and the second being the description and assessment of the ability of local laws and programs to implement best management practices to protect water quality. This component requires a thorough inventory of the water bodies and watershed based on existing data. That existing data can come from DEC's water body inventory and priority list, DEC's water quality classifications, any state, county, regional, or local planning and monitoring programs, and if there's any additional or new information that's being collected specifically for this project. The scale for which this primary unit analysis, the presentation, the recommendations should be at the sub-watershed level. The level of analysis done at a sub-watershed scale is helpful when identifying recommendations and developing an implementation strategy. Visualizing what's happening and what the resource concerns are within a sub-watershed can allow you to target and focus projects in a sub-watershed to develop recommendations that will have the biggest impact in that area. That is not to say there won't be watershed-wide recommendations, but not every recommendation that's made needs to happen at a watershed-wide scale. You know, an example of this would be in the table above, identifying primary land use in a certain sub-watershed may have BMPs, ag BMPs for have a sub-watershed that's primarily agriculture, but a sub-watershed that's primarily developed land. Maybe you want to focus on stormwater best management practices. One important idea that I do want to emphasize that this is an inventory and an assessment. We require more than just an inventory of the resources. We really want you to analyze and assess the information collected, draw some conclusions from that information. The next component of the characterization is the ability and effectiveness of local laws and programs to implement best management practices to protect surface and groundwater and habitat from point and non-point source pollution. This can include review of how existing laws and programs apply to new and existing development, roads and bridges, on-site wastewater treatment systems, marinas, forestry and agriculture, habitat and hydrologic modification, riparian area management. You know, there's quite a few. The assessment should identify and document any gaps in that data or information. This exercise is intended to result in an understanding of all the municipalities' ability to effectively manage water quality as related to local regulations, routine operation and management practices, training, and outreach programs. This section shall be conducted in an interactive manner and include participation from municipal leaders. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, this is not just an inventory of existing local laws and programs, analyzing this information is vital when making recommendations and implementing projects. As an example, I know it's a little blurry, but that first column, or I guess the second, the comprehensive plan, if you were just checking who had a comprehensive plan and who didn't have a comprehensive plan, that doesn't take into consideration how old that comprehensive plan is. Does that comprehensive plan include any language on water quality? So we really want you to think about how effective the laws in place are and what additional laws could be helpful. All right, now we move on from what is to what we want or what can be. I think a lot of people view documenting what is can be a lot easier than the next step, which is what to do about it. So the goal of this section is to explain how water quality will be protected and restored within your watershed through a series of projects and actions developed to correct existing impairments and prevent future impacts on water quality. You should explain how your specific recommendations and include discussion of the assessments conducted which support the recommendations. When appropriate, keying the actions to maps helps visualize the recommendations as well as better prepare community to seek funding in the future. The map in this slide is a subwatershed within the St. Lawrence River Watershed Plan that was recently completed. They completed an analysis of each subwatershed and determined the concerns for each, identifying high, medium, and low priority recommendations. Watershed recommendations are generally broken up into two categories: regulatory and programmatic, and restoration and protection projects. Examples of both are included on the slide, although there are many more potential recommendations that can be made. Use existing data and information you've collected while preparing your watershed characterization and assessment to help you frame your recommendations. These assessments will help you develop specific management recommendations based on existing problems. An example is an aquatic corridor assessment may lead you to identify areas needing stream bank stabilization. Similarly, upland assessments may lead you to identify agricultural BMPs that would be particularly beneficial. This section requires you to think about what the problems are, where are they located, and what on-the-ground project or regulatory action can help reduce adverse impacts on the watershed. As I mentioned previously, it's often helpful to organize your recommendations into watershed-wide and sub-watershed recommendations. Watershed-wide recommendations can include broad-reaching recommendations for an entire watershed, which may include building capacity within a watershed organization, adopting local laws for environmental protection, or creating monitoring project tracking systems. Sub-watershed recommendations tend to be more site-specific. They can include implementing stream stabilization on a specific creek, installing stormwater retrofits along a specific road or roads, performing additional assessments at specific locations. The subwatershed scale offers a variety of water quality and management options that can help you focus and tailor your recommendations to specific problem areas. You may want to develop management recommendations that focus on a particular pollutant, such as maybe nitrogen. In that example, you may want to focus on all the various activities generating that particular pollutant. On the other hand, you may want your recommendations to focus on a single activity known to be the most significant source of pollutant in your watershed or subwatershed. Keep in mind that this may take more than one approach, project, or action to fully address a particular problem or concern. Remember to cover all your bases and look at the problems from all angles. Each recommendation does not have to meet all the watershed goals, but collectively they should. Involve the public when deciding which alternative is best for the community. Not only will this build support for your plan, but a lot of the times they have great ideas. Your recommendations should be justified in the watershed plan. So the first time we hear about a recommendation or a problem shouldn't be in this recommendation. So if you're identifying invasive species as a priority project, then in your characterization, we should have heard about the invasive species problems in the watershed. The next step is to take those management strategies and recommendations and develop a prioritized list with supporting justification. This should also include photos showing project locations and conditions. This prioritization process should include evaluating subwatersheds according to the impairments and threats, identifying priorities within subwatersheds for focused non-point source pollution management action, ranking projects. Potential ranking factors may include the watershed goals, subwatershed priorities, and vulnerability, pollutant reduction, protection afforded, water resources, or habitat value, cost, permitting and maintenance, landowner cooperation, public access, visibility, partner involvement, and innovation. You may want to develop some ranking factors to compare your project and actions. It may be helpful to prioritize your on-the-ground projects and your regulatory actions separately, though, because they can be pretty difficult to compare using the same metrics. So we really want these plans to be living documents and not sit on the shelf. So we spend a lot of time encouraging communities on developing implementation strategies. Nobody wants this to just die when we finish. So we want this to be easy for you all to use and something that is engaging. So having a list of recommended on-the-ground projects and regulatory and programmatic actions is the starting point. Preparing an implementation strategy will help you develop your ideas and allow you to set out a plan for putting these recommendations into action. Most communities will not be able to implement all their recommended actions or projects simultaneously. So when it comes to an implementation strategy, you have to prioritize your recommendations, and this helps you decide what to tackle first. As I said in the previous slide, once you have your list of priority recommendations, you now have to think about how you will begin to implement them. Who will be involved? What permits are needed? What watershed goals are we targeting? What's the cost? What funding sources may be available to help you support this project? How much time will it take? Are you going to need to phase the project? So you may not know what the construction costs are going to be for a stream restoration project right now, because the stream restoration project needs to be designed first, needs to be modeled. So, the first step would be maybe a scoping project, and then subsequently, in X number of years, construction. Like in that vein, not all projects or recommendations need to be or can be very detailed at the completion of your watershed plan. As more information on the individual projects is gained, budgets evolve, and your experience grows, you'll be able to, in many instances, really beef up this section. Another critical component of this is to identify what can be completed in the short, mid, and long term. This will help you prioritize your projects and plan for implementation. An example of a short term, which may be 1 to 2 years, could be a culvert replacement or hiring a watershed coordinator. A midterm, so maybe 2 to 4 years, could be a shoreline and river restoration project completing. And then maybe long term, you establish sources of funding for long-term implementation, and that's an ongoing recommendation. Presenting your recommendations clearly in your watershed plan will help you answer some of these questions and will allow potential partners and funding agencies to determine whether the time and assistance they provide will be well spent. Placing brief descriptions of projects and other actions in a table will clearly show the priority projects and how you expect to implement them. The table here is from our guidance document, but many watershed plans DOS has funded or helped to fund are available online and can be a great resource for examples. I think I always encourage communities to look at other watershed plans because, many times we all do it. We know the problems that are important to us, and sometimes looking at another plan or looking at an example, it opens your eyes to other things you could include because, there's no limit on the number of projects that you can include in this, and that you shouldn't limit yourself. So here is an example from the implementation strategy and schedule in OWASCO's watershed management plan. Note that they include target area, their goals addressed, project leaders, potential funding, cost, priorities, and timelines. Now, this is, like I said, just a very small excerpt. They have a quite substantial list in their plan. Highly recommend you take a look if you're curious. Again, this is another one. This is from the St. Lawrence River Watershed Management Plan. They tied all their projects to their goals, placed and organized the document by categories they identified, and the sub-watershed where they were a priority. Identify partners, timeframes, and approximate cost. You know, the St. Lawrence River Watershed Management Plan, they were looking at a huge watershed. You know, St. Lawrence River Watershed is enormous. So they took a unique approach in how they prioritized and identified priority recommendations for each watershed. So I highly recommend people looking at that if they're interested in how tackling a really large area. Moving on to the final section, creating a plan to track and monitor not only projects that have been completed, but their successes and value add to the watershed is often overlooked, but a vital component of watershed improvement projects. As many of you know, monitoring is often underfunded and not always done consistently. But by developing a strategy to track project implementation, you will hopefully be creating a framework that not only allows you to document successes, but learn, refine, and change course as necessary to ensure resources are used wisely and the program is using the best information available to improve water quality and watershed health. Measuring success and evaluating improvements is key to continued water quality improvement. Successes can be measured in different ways, including the number of projects completed, total acres conserved, measuring changes in water quality and habitat. Limiting yourself to just one factor may be a hindrance because things like water quality can take years to see changes. Creating a monitoring plan will help you organize your monitoring efforts and track your progress. Designing a method for tracking and monitoring at this stage can help keep implementation organized and the information valuable. Managing implementation of a large number of projects can be complex and time-consuming, and developing a system that will work for your watershed is critical. You know, if you have this really complicated, elaborate system and not everybody knows how to do it, then it's not helpful. Tracking and monitoring should be used to report on your progress to your partners, your agencies, and individuals. Changes are constantly occurring throughout your watershed. Water quality concerns are different than they were 10 years ago. They will likely be different in the next 10 years. So identifying the need to make revisions on a regular basis is important. Updating your plan to reflect changes in your community, the goals of the watershed, the regulatory environment, changes in technology, and so on will keep your plan relevant. As goals are met, you should create new goals, keep your plans in line with the current conditions. The two tables on the right, completed by the Owasco Watershed Plan, they include tributary monitoring plan, and they also developed the table to measure progress, recognizing the different ways one can measure success, as I mentioned, is critical to understanding the full impact of your program. All right, the plan is done. As you wrap up your watershed management plan, you now need to transition to implementation. Your implementation strategy and schedule should inform your approach to implementation. After years of hard work developing a management plan, to continue the momentum and excitement, we encourage communities to get right into implementation, showing the public that their participation is being used. As mentioned earlier, the first project isn't always the highest priority. Sometimes it's just a project that's really visible or has significant public interest, or is even something as simple as it can be completed quickly and you can advertise, or you can share that you checked your first box. These are some projects, implementation projects that the Department of State is currently working in partnership with Canandaigua Lake Watershed. The first is a map of sampling locations for a macrophyte study that they are doing with a few goals, but one of which is to determine the richness of aquatic macrophytes within the lake. They also installed a public access point in a kayak launch at Canandaigua Lake, which came from a water trail planning project. And that water trail planning project was a project that they had identified in their implementation plan. And then this last map is a an example of a mapped drainage area. They are using GIS data to generate drainage areas and flow paths to address chronic flood risks, which will facilitate better riparian management and aid in the development of priority projects throughout the watershed. This is just really like a diverse suite of projects that just are happening in Canandaigua Lake right now. And that's it for me. I hope I did okay on time. The link in the middle, the model local laws to increase resilience, I just want to call that out specifically. Recently, Department of State released these model local laws, you know, with the purpose of resilience, but they have a lot of water quality impacts and create a great resource for local communities looking to increase the resilience, not only from a climate change perspective, but from a water quality perspective as well.
Great, thank you so much, Kate. Got some good questions coming in. So one of them is from John Gephards, who's from the Quassia Creek Watershed Alliance. John will be one of our presenters tomorrow, talking about the Quassia Creek Watershed Management Plan that was done with the Department of State funding and framework. And John asks, what is the process for officially doing an update or an addition to an existing watershed management plan?
So it really depends on, you know, what kind of an update you need that is eligible for Department of State funding. So you can reach out to myself or Department of State in general to kind of look at your existing plan and talk through, you know, do you not really need an update to your characterization? Do you really just want to go back through your goals and just make sure that your projects align with what you've, what your current priorities are? You know, it really depends on the scope of an update you need. But based on what you need, we can, you know, tailor a work plan and, you know, fit it to you.
Great, thank you. It's interesting to see the combination of the local policies along with the on-the-ground practices in terms of the actions and strategies. Does Department of State monitor land use policy changes over time in places where you've funded or supported projects, or to evaluate the success of those projects? Things like wetland and watercourse laws or steep slope ordinances, floodplain management, and so on.
That doesn't depend on the watershed. So we have funded the drafting of model local laws and provided financial resources. So obviously in that case, we're very involved in that process, but it also depends on the community. We like to stay involved, we want to stay active, but if a community or watershed isn't necessarily sharing that information, it's hard to keep tabs on everybody.